Chapter 8: The March of Christianity and the Church. Christianity is the religion that grew out of the life and death of Christ. He didn't mean it to become an extension of the ancient Jewish religion and the God of the book. He even pointed out that his teaching brought a new paradigm and a new era in human spirituality. However, he was a Jew, as were his assistants, disciples, and followers, and regarded by them as the Messiah and the Son of God and the book, and therefore the Son of the God of the book. Therefore the book and the God of the book remained central to his story and was incorporated into the new Christian movement, and there it remains to this day, providing the basis for much of Christian fundamentalism, avoiding persecution, preaching and teaching and practicing Christian principles such as love, caring, and sharing occupied the early days of Christianity within Rome and the Empire. Gradually there came acceptance until Christianity being a force that could no longer be ignored by Rome. The Emperor Constantine became a Christian, the persecutions ended, and Christ and the ancient God of the book were elevated to the top of the heap, and the philosophy and movement conceived as anti-power were now in power position. Did Constantine disband his armies and free his slaves? Constantine was an emperor, and he wasn't about to act the fool. But he did have a problem. Some of his Christian soldiers were questioning the ethics of war, and this was a testing time for Constantine and his Christianity. However, he had this problem solved for him by repeatedly the greatest theologian of Christianity, St. Augustine. He was an eminent Christian teacher and a friend of the emperor, and he had a dilemma. To refuse the emperor could lose the Christians all their gains of the past 100 years and perhaps send them back to the days of persecution. So he made a pragmatic ruling, holding to this day that Christians could go to war, provided it was a just war. From that day forward, the ethos of Christianity fell in hard times. Every war is a just war for the victors, and our Christianity was now a part of the power structure and our world, and the Roman Empire belonged to it. Such a structure required leaders, and soon the Roman Catholic Church was born, the greatest spiritual material entity the world has ever known. The end of the Roman Empire saw the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, with the Church and the Pope at its head, controlling all the Western kingdoms, wielding the power of spiritual and material life and death over all the Western world. And rule she did for over 1,000 years, wherein she managed to separate our power structure from Christian practice. By granting the divine right of kings, she secured loyalty and protected herself from any attack. She built up an organization that in essence endures to this day, an organization professing Christianity and on a higher level practicing power. The rise of new religions born out of our corruption, the rebellion of nations and kings in recent times, 2 world wars, have driven her back to the few hectares of the Vatican state. Yet she still possesses great riches and wields enormous influence and power. She may no longer lead armies and make war, but the internal structure set up over the millennium has served to protect her down the centuries. Regardless of nationhood, the Church was only one leader, and that is the Pope. He is served, supported, guided, and some say controlled by a bureaucracy of cardinals and officials with traditional rules and philosophy enduring for nearly 2,000 years. Kingdoms may rise and fall, but the rules and regulations mean that even without Rome, the Church can survive on the faith of her followers. She claims to be the Church of Christ, who promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. This was Christ speaking to St. Peter, and the Church was 400 years in the future. What Christ was describing was the Christian ethos and the subsequent movement of the world. In a sense, the Catholic Church could be termed an usurper of his intensity. She took and turned them to power and abuse of power. However, there is an upside. There are millions of people today and down the centuries living good Christian lives because of her teaching, not of her example. And this is because her structures were protected from scrutiny by her assured religious authority. It is a future of all religions that distinguishing practices are established to bind the devotees to the religion. Protocols, teaching, practice, and brainwashing are used to bind followers, thus preserving the bums on seats needed for success. The Christianity of Christ was devoted to preaching and teaching a gospel of love and care and spirituality, and finally the introduction of the Eucharist. However, when Christ became a God, then the Church introduced the practices that had supported religions down the centuries. These are the protocols of worship, sacrifice, and service designed to show and demonstrate the faith of followers, where the worship and sacrifice naturally translated the gifting of tithes of treasure and property that went to uphold the Church's father and allowed her to amass huge riches and power. To demonstrate the glory and quality of worship, cathedrals were built on the penance of the poor, and Christ's successors on earth became a king throughout the world of Christendom. However, throughout these centuries of material growth, there existed a core of many people who preferred the teaching of Christ, and besides the evil, much good arose from her scholars in education and law and science and medicine. The corruption in the Roman establishment was contained mostly within the hierarchy and establishment. The popes, the cardinals, and bishops in Christ's message was not degraded too much in the lower echelons, but through her historic internal design secrecy and protections, the corruption of ages still lived in her authority structures. These structures were great for her preservation, but their age-old corruptions will eventually bring her down. In our modern age, child abuse has been the propensity to do just that. It must be realized that this evil is not a church thing, but a human being thing of our ages of savagery. The history of humanity is tied to the operation, use, and abuse of power in all its aspects, but it is the abuse of sexual power has always been the most common. This is because men are generally stronger than women and much more so than children. Our ancient world saw nothing much wrong with such abuse, and it was sociably tolerated up until the 19th century, and in some areas still is. The emancipation of women had in this area a highly civilizing effect on our society, but within the secretive church structure, a different paradigm had been in place for hundreds of years. Teaching influenced religious control of parents and children, clothed in the robes of Christ. Love, care, and responsibility give priests and those within the church great success and power. The laws of celibacy were more directed against sex with women, and for some, children became the next available target. This has led within the church structure to a hardcore collective teaching all the way to Rome, and has been established for centuries, protected by authority, blindness, and collaboration. Most of these power sex abusers were and are themselves homosexuals who have recognized the structure of the church as friendly to their proclivities. After all, it was the church which gave us the castrati. The present-day child abuse scandals are but a reflection of human power sex down the ages. The pleasure of sex, driven by the aphrodisiac of power to many individuals, is an irresistible addiction. In closed cultures like the church, after centuries of accommodation, it is inevitable it came to be recognized and sought out by those with this proclivity. Other closed societies like the military face the same problem, though there it was tolerated to achieve discipline, instant obedience to orders, and the destruction of sensitivity. While these types of societies exist, there will always be those with inclinations to take advantage of them. The gates of hell will not prevail against Christianity, but structural changes will come. Scandal and corruption will lead to the fall or reorganization of Rome, and Christians, supported by genuine priests, will abandon much religious practice and more to everyday Christian living, the helping of each other, helping the poor, seeking social justice. Practice will replace worship, and as long as a genuine priesthood is preserved with the integrity of the Eucharist, Christianity will live. The integrity of the Eucharist is a strange thing. If there was a virgin birth, it could only be the result of a spiritual interference. If the Eucharist becomes the body of Christ in reality, this is also a spiritual act of interference in the natural order of things. The infusion of the Spirit of Christ into bread and wine so that it can be taken into our bodies is somewhat like a spiritual inoculation. The only grounds we have for believing this is faith and the belief in the demonstrated spirit strength of Christ, who inaugurated it. And for Christians, Christ is all we have. One of the biggest problems for Christianity is its maintenance of faith, practices, belief in the Old Testament and the God of the book. This flawed history has been allowed to overshadow Christian teaching, producing the same contradictions in Christian religion as it had in pre-Christian Jewish society. Many Christians and fundamental Christian sects put more emphasis on the Bible and on Jesus Christ. This is despite Christ's teaching that he was bringing a new way, a different paradigm that led to resurrection and eternal life in a new kingdom in our afterlife. But still this ancient book holds sway. Let us see what it has delivered. We must not forget that the Bible was, like its God, invented by the Jews exclusively for the Jewish people, and they are an intriguing race, held together by their God and this book. For 6,000 years, they are a nation built in tribal and blood relations that has preserved their integrity for all that time. Their strangest feature being that the raison d'etre 6,000 years ago has remained their foundation stone, and the present possession of a reportedly God-given land in the Middle East called Israel, their promised land, sacred to the Jews. No other race has so stubbornly pursued such a dream and reality. The fact that the God that promised them and gave them this land never existed, but was the creation of very clever ancestors who wanted to build a nation and were able to direct spiritual belief in material success. Regardless of all that, down the ages, they may have chosen to be an extraordinarily gifted race, given much to the world, for their refusal to bow to different gods has brought much exploitation, pain, and suffering. Ostracized, persecuted, and genocided for hundreds of years by Western Christians as retaliation for the murder of Christ, they have stubbornly held their dream and now become the proud nation of Israel, their promised land. Surrounded by Arab nations that hate them for ancient Semitic reasons, the situation is a classic study in the enduring effect of spirit in just faith and religion. Hated by their brother Arabs and treated warily by Christendom for the murder of Christ, they hold grimly to the Eretz Israel, which will have a profound effect on world affairs. As I have said, they are a strange, gifted and stubborn people who did give us a God, who gave us Christ, and they must not forget but forgive the murder of Christ, without which happening there would have been no resurrection.